time for war. Noah 57:84. There's a season for everything. A time to tear down and a time to build up. A time to kill and a time to heal. 10 generations after creating the world, God decided it was a time to tear the world down. The world was full of Hamas, which means violence. Rashi understands this to mean robbery. By the way, there's no etymological connection between the word Hamas we see in the Torah and Hamas, the terrorist group, other than the fact that Hamas is certainly violent. But the anarchy which existed at this time was reminiscent of the tohu ovohu, the primordial chaos. I love that translation, by the way. The primordial chaos or disorder that existed before God created and gave structure to the world. At this point, God decided he was done tinkering, trying to fix the world, and instead we'd tear it down and start anew with his prototype, Noah, who would create version 2.0 of the world. Israel finds itself in the same position. This is a time to tear down. After attempt to build up the Palestinians has ended in disaster, Israel has no choice but to tear down. The Jews accepted the partition of Palestine in 1948. The Arabs did not. Israel has attempted to improve the lot of the Palestinians by providing them with housing and improved medical care. But this is often opposed because many do not want to see the Palestinian lot improved. They'd rather have the Palestinians serve as pawns in an attempt to humiliate Israel. Israel courageously took risks for peace by entering the Oslo Accords and saw that its citizens were being subject to wave of terror attack after wave of terror attack. When Israel withdrew unilaterally from Gaza in 2005, Hamas simply moved up and began shooting missiles into the south of Israel regularly. The policy of mowing the grass also has not worked. This policy simply meant that Israel would tolerate a low level of violence against its citizens from Hamas, and periodically would go in to try to weaken Hamas's capability when the violence became too much. Then there'd be a ceasefire called, Hamas would rearm, and the cycle would start again. The events of Shabbat Shmini Atzeret, October 7th, have demonstrated this policy was an absolute failure. This is no longer a time to tinker or a time to build up. This is not a time of relative peace. This is a time to tear down, a time of war. The atrocities we've seen perpetrated by Hamas remind us that though God challenges us to rise above our selfish base desires, which led to the Mabul of a flood, many have failed. Gaza has failed. Instead of taking advantage of the tremendous amount of aid the world has given them to build a state, they've redirected the money to use it to perpetuate a war against Israel. Its residents have been condemned to a state of tohu or vohu, that primordial chaos, that anarchy, which led to the Great Flood. In Gaza, you do not find an orderly society. You find a culture which celebrates death and destruction. Israel has no choice but to tear this culture down to ensure that this never happens again. But of course, crushing Hamas won't be pretty. War is hell. The loss of any innocent life is heartbreaking. After all, we're all created B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. Yet the sad reality is, despite the fact undoubtedly there are many in Gaza who simply want to live in peace and are not interested in engaging in a war against Israel, Hamas was elected and is very popular amongst the residents of Gaza. In Gaza, the children are inculcated to hate Jews. They count dead Jews. On Sesame Street, children are given jihad action figures to play with. This is a culture which conquest, and killing. And nothing illustrates this better than the use of children as human shields. And of course, Hamas has its apologists to protect it, attempting to muddy the waters at every turn. These useful idiots see the Palestinians as David fighting the Israeli Goliath. And of course, there are the outright anti-Semites who may pay lip service to the idea that Israel has the right to defend itself, but label any and every Israeli action as heavy-handed and disproportionate, and hold Israel to a standard that no other country in the world would ever be held to. The New York Times, a so-called paper of record, uncritically accepted Hamas's claim that it was an Israeli rocket that struck the hospital in Gaza City, despite the fact Hamas has a long history of lying about these matters. To his credit, President Joe Biden, while in Israel, said that he believed that the rocket had come from Gaza and accidentally fallen short and hit the hospital. In other words, as he said, this was the fault of the other team, of, in this case, Islamic Jihad. Interestingly enough, those who immediately jumped up and criticized Israel for hitting the hospital suddenly fell silent when it was discovered and proven that it was a rocket fired by Islamic Jihad. The bottom line is, this is a time to tear, a time of war, and a war there will be collateral damage. The US accidentally bombed a wedding party in Afghanistan. The Allies bombed Dresden during World War II. And of course, in order to end World War II, the US dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. David McCullough, who wrote a biography on Truman, explains that there was never any discussion as to whether or not to use the atomic bomb. It was simply understood that if the US was able to develop the bomb and the war was still going on and Japan refused to surrender, the bomb would be used to end the war. McCullough even says that when Truman ordered that the bomb be dropped, he slept very well that night because he understood his job was to win the war and save American lives. Now, this is certainly a judgment call. You could debate it. You may oppose Truman's decision. But the reality is we do not live in Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden. Hamas has sunk the region it lives in, the region Israel lives in, into tohu or primordial chaos, anarchy, violence. Regrettably, this is a time to tear, a time for war. But we also should remember that though God did tear the world apart, though he destroyed the world, he destroyed it with the intent of rebuilding. Hopefully, in the aftermath of the destruction of Hamas, there will be rebuilding in Gaza, just as Germany and Japan were rebuilt after World War II. We should also praise President Biden. This is the first time in history a U.S. president announced that he was going to visit an ally under siege. He's also been able to tear himself from this old State Department mentality, this failed mentality, to the chagrin of many of his supporters on the left, by the way, that the key to peace is pressuring Israel to make concession after concession while not holding the Palestinians accountable. Now, hopefully, President Biden, the U.S., and the world will continue to remember, even as the collateral damage increases and Israel is undoubtedly demonized, the words of Kohelet still ring true today. There's a time to tear down, a time to build up, a time to kill, and a time to heal. After this time of war has passed, may we experience a time of healing, and perhaps then our enemies will finally be ready to make peace.